Zoom.
All right, Laura, are you there?
How you doing, Lance?
Great. How are you, John?
So far, so good.
All right. All right. We've got Liz Aguilar in the attendees, and we have myself, Lori, you, John, Linda, and we have Linda. We're just waiting on Neverchima. Okay. Rick and Michael and Liz and John Matos and Brian Goodby. Let's give member Chima another couple of minutes. While we wait for her to, while we wait, and just kind of lay out kind of some, a couple things. The purpose of today's meeting is to discuss the parameters and the timeline for conducting a survey for the feasibility of a bond and or a tax parcel measure for the November 2020 election. A couple of things. Since this is a study session, we'd like to make this as interactive as possible. The folks that are actually in the attendees tab, which at this point are Brian will probably bring you in as a panelist probably to talk through some of this stuff. But if there are questions at any time from anybody in the attendees list, use the raise your hand function, and we'll give the floor over to you, and then you can we'll try to make this as interactive as possible. And also there'll be a time towards the end of the agenda where we will also kind of open up the floor for additional questions. We've got 90 minutes for this meeting. We'll try to keep as close to the time as possible. Before we proceed, any questions from any of the members of the board? Okay, we've got Sarabjit now. Member Chima is here. Okay. Are there any questions from anybody, including the folks that are in the attendees that are not on the panel. And just as a reminder, if you are dialed in, press *9 to raise your hand, which right now there's nobody who are dialed in. We got a question from Mr. Gartner. All right. Please proceed, Mr. Gartner.
All right, so this isn't a question, but just a comment to thank the board for arranging this meeting so that it could be interactive. I know it's a new thing and I hope it goes really well because I think having more dialogue should be productive for everyone involved. So I just want to say on the record that we appreciate listening to the desire for more dialogue and then making that happen. So thank you.
Great. We're really glad that we could make this happen. Okay. All right, then, Annette, did you want to kind of take us through some of the background so that we can kind of work through some of this?
Sure, I could do that. So good afternoon, everyone. I'm the Chief Business Officer of the district, and I want to provide some context and background in terms of some of the work that had already been done leading us to this conversation today. So looking back in the last 10 years in terms of ballot measures that the district had attempted, we want to go back to 2011 when the district tried for a parcel tax measure. And again, the following year, 2012, both attempts were not successful. There was a survey done prior to the first one, which was in 2011. And a few years later, the district attempted, which is in 2014, a general obligation bond measure, and it passed by, it was a Prop 39 ballot measure, therefore we needed 55%. It was the success level of that was over 68%, which is consistent with the experience and the support level in terms of GeoBond in this community. I also would like to talk about, like I said, that was in November 2014. Now, last year, we were wanting to explore the feasibility of a parcel tax. You know, we had a lot of really good support and dialogue that we wanted to explore how possible or how, get a sense from our community in terms of the support level, and therefore, I need to back up. Prior to that, we actually, given a lot of the dialogue and feedback that we were getting in terms of the housing cost in the area that we live in, and I know this is an emerging thing, but we wanted to test it, is actually a GeoBond that would incorporate employee housing in the ballot measure. And therefore, we wanted to see the level of support from the community. And therefore, in the spring of 2019, we went out in the field work to do some survey. We presented those results in the summer of 2019 to the board in a regular public meeting in August. And a lot of things had evolved since then that the board had an interest in also looking in terms of the feasibility of a parcel tax. And therefore, last December, we were given authorization by the board to conduct a study or a survey for a parcel tax. And at that time, when that survey was completed, we already had a budget and finance committee. And therefore, the results of those were presented to that committee in January. Now, wanting to have a full picture of all of these things and incorporating the election results in March, we held a board study session to, for the most part, to really look at the merits of each potential ballot measure. In other words, should we go for a parcel? Should we go for a GeoBond? What are the merits of each one, and what are our chances? And therefore, that study session in March 4 was held. Following that, and I'm getting to my to our present time. In addition to continuing that conversation as well, and including our community and our parent representatives from each of the school sites, as well as our labor partners, we held a budget finance committee at the end of May. And in that committee, essentially the discussion was a lot of things have changed. Pre-COVID-19 were the two surveys, and now the economy and the industry had seemed to have turned upside down in more ways than one, and therefore the discussion was there's an interest to do another survey given the changes in circumstances, and that and therefore my homework from that last meeting was to research and reach out to a few recommended polling firms, and therefore we did that and we presented that to the board. And in fact, we have a guest today from that recommended polling firm in order to be able to address any questions and give us some feedback and, you know, essentially the environment in terms of a ballot measure for the November election. I know that was a long one, but I wanted to start from the beginning.
No, that was excellent. That was a really good recap of what's transpired so far. So I think that served its purpose. I think at this point now, it would be good for maybe to have Brian start to maybe talk a little bit about what his findings have been over the last, since we put him on this work. Now, let's see here. Are you a panelist? There you are. You're a panelist. Okay, you're unmuted. And all right, Brian, please feel free to proceed.
Great, thank you very much. Thanks for having me today, everybody. Can you all hear me well enough? Okay, I hear people shaking hands. Oh, yeah, it's great. Okay. Well, again, thank you for being here. I won't repeat what Annette said about the polling, but to summarize, the bond survey started at 60% and it moved to 66%. And for a simple majority measure, that's a pretty good place to be. Obviously, it's what needs to be on the ballot, and we need to look at that. But in the previous polling, that's not bad. The parcel tax was at 61 and moved up to 66. That's a tougher place to be because obviously you need 2/3, not a 55% majority. And so I think that's problematic because we like to see our parcel taxes cover the error rate on the survey. And that means that if you've got a 4% error rate and you're trying to get 67, we want to see it somewhere around 71. So obviously this survey didn't have you at above the 66.7% level, let alone covering the error rate. So that's a bit problematic. So that's a quick recap on the data without going through it on a page-by-page basis. Well, there's certainly opportunity to do that at some future point. The climate, though, that we're surveying right now has been interesting. We've done some 17 surveys since the COVID shutdown started back in March, and we've found some pretty consistent patterns. One of them has been that people are pretty happy and view the state and local government, including local school districts' efforts to address the crisis positively. They've got an overwhelmingly favorable view. We've seen it be as low as 65% favorable and as high as 80% favorable. Varies obviously from community to community, but if you just watch the news, you might think that everybody thought the state and local governments were doing a terrible job in Northern California. That's clearly not the case. We've also asked people about their forecast, if you will, for the economy in the next 6 months. And we've seen some mixed results there. Obviously, people are hurting, so that's not surprising. But we've seen people thinking it's going to be worse in 6 months, as high as 44%, but as low as 33%. And that's 33% for that kind of economic forecast is not atypical at all. The other things that we've seen is a surprisingly large number of simple majority and 55% majority measures that are feasible and are moving forward. And that's all over the Bay Area and a little broader in Northern California as well. Most of these, though, started before the protests and before the murder in Minneapolis. So there's a new wrinkle, not just the COVID-19, and we need to be aware of that. Now, I think that impacts cities and agencies that are providing public safety services more than it impacts school districts. So again, we're going to be cautious about that. We may be adding a question about awareness of the protests, not so much whether you support or oppose them, just whether you're aware of it, to see if that has any impact on support ultimately in a crosstab fashion. So what most people thought back in the middle of March was there's no way we're gonna have revenue measures on the ballot, and that's absolutely not the case. We're probably going to see a record number of revenue measures on the ballot in November. And to put that in context, because it's a little bit counterintuitive, you just think back to the Enron financial crash, to the 9/11 tragedy, and then ultimately the housing market crash in 2008. In all of those cases, we saw a record number of revenue measures on the ballot, and we experienced record levels of success. So I think we need to keep what's going on in perspective. Obviously, we're in the middle of crisis, and there's no, saying we're not, but that doesn't mean that people don't need to have services and facilities in their communities. The thing that, of course, and the reason for doing another survey is to find out at what level that applies to the New Haven School District. And it may be that a bond measure fits into that simple majority, 55% majority level that I said we're seeing is successful in the surveys. And we'll have to find out if it applies to the 2/3 threshold for a parcel tax. And then we'll have more information to provide the board so you can make an informed decision. Any questions about that current climate sort of thing?
All right, I'm looking for raised hands. We've got 2 from the audience. So I've enabled everybody to talk. So go ahead. Why don't we start with Michael first? All you have to do is unmute.
Hi, thank you. Michael Gardner. I am the treasurer at NHTA and also the PAC chair. I had a question about the polling data that you were citing. You said that about 60% were in favor of a ballot measure. Was that including undecided, or if you could give a little bit more detail, just because I know that in the past people have used that stat, but ignoring the undecided, and I'm just curious how much undecided is expected to split down the middle, or more one way or more one way another way?
So that's a good question. And I'm looking at the final test on the bond measure where we wound up at, or you wound up at 65.8%. So that's definitely yes of 30, 31, I'll just round, probably yes of 35, undecided leaning yes of 1%, still undecided 6%, undecided leaning no 0.5%, probably no 10%, and definitely no 11%. Different pollsters have different approaches to methodology. First of all, I would say the total undecided is about 7.5%. That's typical. We don't push people into leaning yes and leaning no. And a couple other pollsters do, and we think that's the wrong approach. I'll be completely candid. And the reason for that is people drop off. If you look at the votes from the president at the top of the ticket to the school bonds at the bottom in any district in California, not everybody that votes for president votes for a school bond. The leaning is a completely valid approach to somebody who says, I'm undecided on the presidential choice, because the only reason they're really going to go to the ballot is to vote for president. So they will make a choice, and counting the leaners does make sense. It doesn't make sense further down the ballot. I think over and over, I've been asked to evaluate measures that have lost, and I see the same thing, that they counted the leaners. We don't do that. We won't do that. Because I think leaners are more likely not to vote. Now, if you want to do a different analysis, assuming that those people are going to be part of the drop-off, then you can just recalculate your base. So instead of it totaling to 100, in this particular case, it would total to about 92.5, and that's going to push your yes number up. But you also, the reason we don't like to do that either is very often the no voters in a tax measure, or I'm sorry, the undecided voters in a tax measure are really hiding. They're no voters who don't have the courage to tell us they're going to vote against a school bond. And while we wouldn't want that to be the case, it is, and we just have to accept that. And so I think that is a pretty detailed explanation, maybe too detailed, of the undecided and our philosophy on that.
Okay. Thank you so much. Next, Rick. Rick Waltham.
Good
I gotta just
afternoon,
unmute yourself.
everyone. Yeah, Rick Wathen, California Teachers Association, working with NHTA and others around. I've had the pleasure of working with Brian in the past many times, and does really solid work. So Brian, glad to see you on this and part of this effort. I wanted to see if we could flesh out a little bit more. You talked about from this last survey that was conducted in the district, the margin of error a little bit. And can you just kind of flesh that out a little bit? I know that you talked about in that survey, I think the bond ended up after the pushes kind of came up to a 68%. And the parcel tax, you said 66%, is that correct?
Yeah, 66 for the parcel tax and 66 for the, I mean, it's just different 66 for each of them for the bond measure. They're both 400 interviews, so that's about a 4.75% margin of error, 5% in round numbers.
And that's plus or minus margin of error, right? It's
right.
either or direction.
Right.
So that could be, upwards of 70% for the parcel tax. And I know based on your probably years of experience that you've seen tests or research that has analyzed it come out of these numbers, where it really depends on the campaign and how you actually get the community involved, where you can actually boost those numbers up and cross the finish line, correct?
In some cases, yes, if they run a stellar campaign, and that's more often the case in a bond measure, unfortunately. It doesn't apply to the parcel tax quite as much because of the heightened threshold. I mean, 2/3 is just tough. Not to say that school districts don't do that, because they do. And that's a good thing. But I always counsel clients that they need to take into account the margin of error on the downside, because that's sort of the worst case scenario. And the bond measure number that you have from before at 66%, even if you look at that on the downside, it's 61. I mean, that's not a huge cushion, but I think that's a good place to be. You still need to run a good campaign for that. And the reason you need to run a good campaign is in that case, you had 35% were probably yes. So, if you just put that on the ballot and walk away from it, you're going to lose half of those probably yeses.
Well, I guess that's my point, right? It's all about the campaign. I just recently worked on a parcel tax, and both Alameda Unified as well as Davis Unified both have very similar demographics, and both research studies actually came out with a 64% favorable rating. And obviously we needed 66.7 to pass both measures. We got there, but it took a concerted effort of the entire community, teachers, classified, parents, administrators, board members on board to do that. And when we're involved together, we can get it across the finish line. I just wanted to find out what your experience was with that. And the last piece I'll just ask is about the methodology of this other study. We've talked a little bit about Isom and Associates and the different types of sort of their methodology in conducting surveys like this. What would you say is the key difference between the way you conduct surveys and the way they do it?
Well, from looking at just the top line reports, and that there's a limited amount of methodology info in there. They're doing phone surveys. And we don't do that anymore. We haven't done that in 6 years because not everybody wants to answer their landline if they even have one, and not everybody answers their cell phone. And we don't know what bias that introduces. So for the last 6 years, we've been doing email invitations to online surveys. And in the last 2.5 years, we've added text invitations to online surveys. And the majority of our completed interviews come actually from the text invitation to that online survey, which people are probably taking on their phone. The format of the survey is designed to accommodate a cell phone, obviously an iPhone or Samsung, whatever. And that's where people are willing to do surveys. Now, we still wind up doing cell phone calls and landline calls to those stratifications within the sample that don't respond. So while the text invite gets a pretty good distribution of the age groups across the district, it's always a little light on the seniors. And the cell phone is not where we pick up seniors. Where we pick up seniors is from making landline calls. And so our methodology is really allowing the respondent to choose which method makes most sense for them. And that way we get a better representation without creating any kind of psychographic bias based on one type of survey methodology versus another. And if you look at, just to sort of expand on that, if you look at the presidential election data, one thing you can almost always predict in the presidential polling is that the all online are more Democratic. The all automated phone are more Republican. So what our methodology is doing is saying, yeah, we know there's a bias out there. We can't predict it, but we're giving everybody the opportunity to answer in the way they want. And that makes the final sample more solid.
What is your response rate for text and or email based surveys versus phone? Like what kind of response rates are you getting?
Yeah, so phone is in the 1% or lower, depending on the community. During the COVID crisis, the beginning part, we were actually having record response rates, and we were getting up to 5% response rate for text, which is the highest.
Now, are those completed surveys or just started surveys?
No, that's completed surveys.
Completed.
But even still, 5%, to get 400, that means, we've sent out a lot of texts.
Yeah, 5% is actually a really, really good response rate.
Yeah, oh yeah, it's phenomenal. It's been up a little bit until this last weekend. And this last weekend, we've started seeing response rates decline across the board, whether it's phone or online. And we think it's because obviously people are going back to work in some cases, and we think people are going, out to the local park and going hiking and wherever they're going to get outside a little more than earlier during the crisis. And that's starting to turn our response rates back to where they were before the crisis.
Okay. So I see, thank you, Rick, for that great question. Next, we have Bill Quirk, Assembly Member.
Thank you. I have a question for Brian, which is, does it make sense to do the poll again to see what these two alternatives would be like in the current atmosphere?
Yeah, thank you, Bill. I appreciate that. We haven't chatted in a long time, but nice to hear you.
You are my favorite pollster.
Oh, thank you. I think it makes sense because these were both conducted before the crisis. And they were before the COVID crisis, and they were also before the Black Lives Matters protests. So I think we need to keep that in mind. And we don't know how that may have impacted support in both of those cases or both of those causes. So we just simply need to find that out again. before.
Another question is, there'll be school board races at the same time this would be on the ballot. If they're heavily contested school board races, how does that affect the yeses and nos? Is that no impact or a big impact or something in between?
Yeah, well, I think it has to do with two things. One is, what's the level of support we get in the survey. So if you've got a bond that's at 65%, and you don't have an intrinsically anti-tax challenger on the ballot, the people running for that seat are going to know it's 65%. And, as a pollster, I would never want to be on the 35% end of that. So in that case, it doesn't have an impact if people look at the polling and say, hey, I support the school bond too. I'm going to run, my campaign's going to be based on something else. The difference though, or the problem is that there might be somebody who wants to run, and we obviously don't know until filing closes, who is anti-tax and is going to run against a school bond or a parcel tax regardless. I don't know if that's a situation in your community, but I do remember having one city bond measure where that happened. We knew, this was in Marin County, and we knew going into the measure that we had a solid 60%, and that we were going to have to run a perfect campaign to get to the 2/3 that they needed and not have any opposition. Well, we ran what we thought was a great campaign, and we got exactly what the polling said, 60%. So the anti-tax council member running put a cap on how much we could move up with a perfect campaign. But on the other side of the coin, we had 40% in our survey that said they were going to vote no on the tax. And that's exactly what the anti-tax candidate got, 40%, and he's not a council member.
Thank you.
Thank you so much. Member Core, you have your hand up.
Yeah, thank you, Brian. I think there's a lot of good questions asked, and I just wanted to piggyback on an earlier question that talks about methodology. First of all, I'm very happy to hear that you're going to be, or at least your firm does a lot of the email and text invites. I know that when we had the original survey done, that was one of my questions to our superintendent, trying to figure out how do you, I don't have a landline, how often? And I think our primary way of conducting interview was through a landline or a phone call. And I think you had alluded to that it was 400 interviews in our previous survey. So what is your sample size? Is it also 400, 500 range?
Well, we're talking about increasing it because we want to do a split sample. So what a split sample means, just to back up a second, is that half of the respondents are randomly assigned the bond measure version of the survey, and half are randomly assigned the parcel tax version. And that way we can get a really good comparison without somebody having to get a question that goes something like, would you vote for a bond? Oh, now ignore the bond. Would you vote for a parcel tax? That never ever works because the parcel tax in this example will do worse. So we would want at least 600 completed interviews to do this comparison. 500 would be okay. It'll depend on the response rates that we see in your community. As some of you may know, the city has been doing surveys, and they're in the field right now with a survey that we're doing that is using that same split sampling methodology. But we would want a larger sample than 400 for sure. Because
okay, great. And my second question, kind of similar to what Bill had asked, I know that, and you obviously know since you work with the city as well on their surveys too, city's going to have a measure on the November 2020 ballot. And how do you think having two ballots, either both revenue ballots, would affect maybe the outcome of our survey? And when you're polling it, is that one of the questions you may have on it?
Yeah, it is definitely a question that we ask that other local agencies are going to have a tax measure on the ballot too. and we haven't talked about our structure, but it's in a section that we call the critical statements. And we point that out and we see if that makes people less likely to support the measure. Now, we don't actually do a ballot question for the city or a ballot question for the county, because the county is considering something as well, because that's sort of their job, not our job for the school district. And I don't think it really helps. But and the reason I don't think it really helps is because well, first of all, there's no ballot that you get to be on by yourself anymore, with the exception of an off-year special election, which you might want to do for a parcel tax. That's a possibility. But there's no general election that there aren't multiple agencies on the ballot at the same time in the same jurisdiction. So, you know, county, city, school district, special district. I mean, we're also aware that you have the Mission Valley Regional Occupation Program, and they are chartered to do revenue measures as well. So they might also have something on the ballot. I don't know that at this point, but that agency exists. So it's not uncommon to have different agencies on the ballot at the same time. I think the key is that they be distinct enough that people can pick and choose, or they can vote for all of them. And so if the city were to have a sales tax and this county were to have a sales tax, well, people might say that's a lot of sales taxes. But the strange thing is it doesn't usually hurt the city measure as much as it hurts the county measure within the city. Because at the end of the day, what people tend to do is think about the measures and then say, well, you know, what's good for my neighborhood? And the city measure, and I'm using that as an example, obviously, the city measure is more local than the county measure. And so very often that's the case. There have been several measures out in Sacramento County, countywide, for transportation that have not fared very well. We actually haven't done the polling, but we've done the polling for a couple different cities, and we've specifically looked at this issue. And the city measures sort of stay at the same level. It's the county measure that goes down at the end of the survey. And since school districts are such a distinct jurisdiction, they usually do the best. And they don't necessarily hurt the city, but I think the city and the county, or city and the school district might hurt the county in Union City.
Just one last question on that. How will your 600 sample be selected? What's your criteria that you by which you choose those 600 people?
So we're obviously looking at likely November 2020 voters, and the best method right now is to look at people who voted in the November 18 election, because we know that for a midterm that was unusually high. To look, or those that voted in the November 16, or those that voted in the November 12. Now, we've intentionally left out the November 14 because that was a historically low turnout, because we had an incumbent governor who everybody thought was going to win in a landslide, and who in fact did. And so that depressed the turnout. So we've skipped over that and used those 3 elections. And then we're also adding new registration, although that's a smaller group than you'd think it would be, quite honestly. And that may be because young people aren't yet engaged. And by September, they might be much more engaged, and that's when they'll start registering. So they're just not there yet. It's hard to figure out who they are because they're not registered.
Member Core, was your question answered?
Yes, thank you very much.
Sure.
Okay. Did you have anything else to add, Mr. Godby?
I was just going to say, I mean, first we look at the likely voters as I described, but then we do a stratification where we're looking at gender, age, partisanship, ethnic surname, part of town. There's whether you own a house, whether you're a renter. We've got income information that we've appended to the voter file. We've got household value information. We've got the household partisanship. So we're looking at a whole bunch of different variables to make sure that the stratifications that we wind up with match the actual voter universe that we're looking at.
Okay, great. I'm going to go back to attendees. Just as a reminder, attendees, if you have already had your question answered, you can go ahead and lower your hand. Otherwise, I'm going to take, if your hand's up, you have still something to add. I'm going to rotate back through people who might have not talked yet. Actually, everybody here. So I'm going to start with Michael, because Michael was the most recent one who talked. Mr. Gardner?
Thank you. So we want to ensure that if we use resources to attempt to pass a bond or a parcel, that we want it to be successful. And I know that there are a lot of factors which are just outside of our control. There's the economy, state and federal initiatives, but there are factors in our control. And I know I'm imagining you've been through a lot of successful and unsuccessful bond and parcel measures. So I was hoping you could get some insight of what are the factors that we can control to help pass a good bond or parcel measure. Thank you.
Sure, good question. Obviously, we're pollsters, so we don't run campaigns, but we certainly work with people that run campaigns. And I think Rick Watham said it earlier, we want to see parents, we want to see bargaining units, we want to see business community, we want to see assembly members, all involved in the campaign and supporting it and working together to do all the things that a campaign needs to do. And, you know, it's just down the routine sheet. We need to register parents who aren't registered. And guess what? You've got a lot of K-3 parents that are registerable that are not registered. And so that's number one. Number two, in the old days, you know, we want to walk precincts. Well, that's not going to happen this fall. So we need to replace the precinct walking with phone calling. Obviously is an easy one, but we've already talked about how phone calling isn't working that well. So volunteers texting voters to identify them as supporters is a big thing that's going to happen. It's time intensive. Obviously, texting takes longer than just dialing a phone number. And so that's something that's going to need to happen. Money's going to need to get raised for direct mail. As much as everybody would like to think that social media is all we need to do to run a successful campaign, that's absolutely not the case. Direct mail is still critical. In addition to social media, we need to have a Facebook presence, we need to have a Twitter presence, we need to have an Instagram presence, etc. And Nextdoor. Nextdoor is a different ball of fish, as I'm sure you all know. But all of those things need to be taken into account to be successful, particularly at the 2/3 level.
Could I follow up on that?
Oh, okay.
So thank you. So you said that getting parents, bargaining unit, business, and elected officials involved is one of the key factors that we can control. Have you seen things that have helped or hurt that in campaigns that other districts have done?
Well, I mean, every district is different. So, you know, and I don't know the relationship that all those people and groups have in your particular district, but, you know, that's where everybody's got to come together. And this is a united front. We can't be running 3 different campaigns or 4 different campaigns. You all got to be on the same page.
Mr. Quirk, you have your hand up.
I just forgot to lower it. Sorry.
Oh, okay, got it. All right, Rick Watham.
Yeah, thank you. I couldn't tell if my hand was up or down based on this program, but thanks for calling on me. Well, listen, first off, thanks, Brian, for all of this analysis. This is helpful stuff. I wanted to get into the meat and potatoes a little bit if we could. I didn't know if we were going to get a chance to see the poll, sort of the draft poll at all during this meeting, or if this is something that's already been decided. But I wanted to ask you a couple questions, Brian. Based on your experience, do you test a different levels of a flat rate for a parcel tax? And would you consider doing a square footage test amount in this district? I know we've done that in other districts and had some successes, so I wanted to get your opinion on that. I do have some follow-up, but I wanted just to cover that first.
Yeah, in terms of the questionnaire, there's no draft yet. The goal here was to get everybody's input. So that's where we're going, and then we'll work with staff to finalize from there. We're on a short time horizon, as you know. In terms of the square foot versus the flat parcel tax, that depends on your legal opinion. But I'll tell you that in Fremont Unified, we spent a bunch of time and effort testing a flat tax versus a per square foot tax, and then their legal counsel said, no, you can't do a per square foot tax. Yes, it's true, as you know, Rick, that in West Contra Costa, they have a per square foot tax. Berkeley has a per square foot tax. And the testing that we did in Fremont, and I'm probably talking out of school, if you will, but the per square foot did better. And we know that they weren't successful in March. So, but it really comes down to legal counsel. And since beginning of last year, I haven't got a legal counsel to say a square foot tax is something they were comfortable with.
Well, we definitely have been down that road in many districts, including Davis. It was just the will of the group as a stakeholder group that we went in with a flat rate, but definitely it's legal as long as it's done consistently. As you know, it's not going to be done differently for businesses versus residential. So it is legal, but that's something so the other part of that question was the flat rate, the different levels. For example, I know that we've tested, 120 to 180, and then all of a sudden we'll test $99, and man, it just goes through the roof because it's below 100 for a parcel tax. Are you doing something like that in this sample?
Yeah, I mean, that is always the case. Everything we buy, and you have to think about this as something we buy, is just like when you go to Target. Everything is $9.99 or $19.99 or $99.99, and there are other levels within there as well, and that applies to $199 versus $200, etc. So it's always useful to have a fallback tax rate, and we do it a little differently now. And we haven't just taken time to explain our structure, but essentially we have a beginning ballot question, a lot of information, and then an ending ballot question, and we keep those at the same rate, and then we fall back from there. And one of the things that has changed, and I think it's partially why bond measures are doing a little better than parcel taxes, is because we have to have now the rate for the bond measure in the ballot question, and we've changed from the X dollars per 100,000 of assessed valuation sort of format to X cents per $100. And I think that has helped bond measures. It makes it harder to do the threshold analysis you're talking about, because what's really the difference between 6 cents per 100 and 5 cents per 100 for a unified school district bond? That's a little different in a parcel tax that might be 199 versus 149 versus 99.
Right. Okay. Well, listen, I have a couple more real quick questions, and that kind of pertain to all of this stuff. One of is you mentioned sort of the timing of this, and obviously time is of the essence. Have you thought about kind of when we need to get into the field and how quickly we can get some results? And when I say results, not only the top lines, but how quickly can political geeks like me look into the crosstabs and really look down into sort of as you mentioned, some of those demographics earlier about where certain folks are moving based on certain messages?
Yeah, I mean, of course, the deadline is August 7th. We don't want to back ourselves into that corner too much. We'll probably would be looking at a board decision if we're going forward the last week in July. Working from the other end, when we get to go ahead on this, takes a few days to finalize the survey, Then it takes 3 days to do the programming. It'll probably in Union City take about 7 to 10 days to do the interviewing to make sure we get that large sample we talked about in order to do the split sampling. And then it takes about 3 days to do the data analysis, data processing and data analysis. So if you add that together, we're looking at almost 4 weeks in there. And so, we really need to hit the ground running here. 4 weeks from today is July 9th. So if we.
Right. So, and my last question is this, and then I'll give up. Because of this amount of work, and you disclosed earlier, and I appreciate the honesty. You're a pollster, you're a researcher. You're not necessarily a political consultant. I'm wanting to really kind of throw out a question to really the board as to, and I really want to stress the importance of considering hiring a political consultant that knows this type of work to do the public phase of it, just because it's so imperative that we pass this measure in November, and because of the climate, and because of the electorate, and because of some possible restraints around the way we campaign, to make sure that we do a really excellent job on the public phase. And I wanted to find out if the board has considered hiring a consultant for that. And if Brian, if you had, I don't know if there's any suggestions you had for the board, but I'd love to hear from the board.
Okay, so Member Core, you had your hand up and you put it back down. Right, your hand.
Yeah, I do have a comment here. If you're going to run a campaign, the board can't hire a consultant. The board can encourage volunteers to go out and raise the money to hire a consultant. The consultant can work with the school district, and I don't know if the school district could pay for this part of it, probably can, to sort of put out informational, but in terms of getting yes and no's, that's got to be done by a volunteer group that's raised a lot of money.
Right, the public and the private phase. That's what I was talking about, Bill.
Yep, okay.
Okay. All right, Member Core, did you have your hand up?
I did, but my question's been answered. It was around the timing of it. I know that we needed to make a decision by July, but it seems like August 7th is our deadline. So that was my question, but it's been answered. Thank you.
All right, great. I'd like to recognize President Angeles. You have your hand up.
Yeah, thank you, President Nishihara. Good evening, Mr. Gabi. Appreciate you coming out and spending some time with us. Again, my name is Joe Couey-Angeles, President, New Haven Teachers Association. I did want to clarify your comment about the timeline of getting out, like say August, that whole timeline you're talking about. But I just want to be clear. So in order to do the things you just described, get all the surveys, things like that, the ideal time to have the concrete supports that you described would have to come before the August, or was that in time for after August, once you get the results? Would that be enough time in your mindset to be enough to kind of pass the thing through? Because obviously, speaking for the teachers union, there's a lot of questions before we can even consider a solid position of support. So I'm just trying to figure the timeline, what you would need for us to be, say, so take a position of support in this whole timeline you described. Thank you.
Yeah, so the county deadline is August, or the state deadline is August 7th. And again, we don't want to back ourselves too much up against that. And that's for the board to make a decision based on the information they have in front of them, which would be the polling, any conversations they've had with bargaining units, as well as with parent groups and those sorts of things. All are inputs into that board decision. The running the campaign part is all after that. And as Assemblyman Quirk noted, there's two distinct parts of that. There's the public information part, which the school district can engage in, which has to be non-advocacy. And then there's the advocacy part of it. I think that an advocacy campaign in August, September, and October, that is sufficient time if the numbers are good. I mean, you can think about it as a runway. And if, the runway's really short, we need to have a plane that's really ready to go. If we don't have a plane that's able to, accelerate quickly, and we'll know that by the numbers, from the survey. So if we get 56 for a bond measure or 67 for a parcel tax, but we're just squeaking by, you know, maybe we need that longer runway because we don't have the high-powered plane that we want to take off. And that means, you know, looking at different election options. There are more options for a parcel tax because you can do any time you want, basically, for in 2021. Bond measures have to wait until 2022. That's not what we're trying to do, but it really depends on what the results of the survey come back at, and which one, you know, do we have enough time between now and November?
Thank you, sir.
Okay. All right. Well, thank you for all your comments. One of the things I'd like to do now is just explicitly poll the board to see if there are any specific questions that they have for Mr. Goodby while we have him here. And then one of the clear things that we have to exit this meeting with is number one, a decision to proceed with the survey, and also an associated timeline, and that we can all agree to. So any questions from any board members that have not yet been answered, or if there are things that they need to know to kind of get them over that line? Member Core.
Yeah, just during our last board meeting, I think there was a comment about whether we will have any say in the questions that will be on the survey. How likely is it that we could provide our input, or can we see the questions ahead of time? I don't even know if it's going to make a difference, but I'm just trying to understand, because there was a comment, I don't know, I don't recall who it was from, but I wanted to just, I guess, just get that clarified.
John,
That's
did you want to? Oh, yeah, I'm certainly happy to answer that. From a methodological perspective, we don't want to bring a questionnaire to the full board and have a public discussion of survey methodology. I'm happy to answer any questions as we've talked about today, but bringing a questionnaire to a board meeting means that people are going to have a copy of the questionnaire and they're going to be sitting around waiting for it. We just don't want to do that. And that's been our best practices for 25 years. Now, if you want to have board input, there are other ways of dealing with that. Some districts choose to have the staff review the questionnaire and work with us, and that's fine with us. Some create an ad hoc committee of a couple board members. Obviously, it's not a Brown Act committee, so we don't have the methodological problem. And so those are some of the options that you have. But we have to realize that we need to move quickly, so scheduling meetings, you know, can be an impediment to moving quickly.
Yeah, that was a concern. Thank you.
And if I can jump in as well, just to kind of capture where we were before, one of the things that we talked about was having some parity between the first two surveys and the current one going out, to make sure that we have an apples to apples comparison that way. So I think the key, my understanding is that the fundamental question, the basic questions that were asked would be, that would be the template for moving forward this way too. I'm not sure if much has changed. We went through this, I mean, we just went through this process just a few months ago for the parcel tax. So I don't know how much has changed in terms of what the priorities are. So, and given the timing, I don't know how we would go about and go through a full process for that anyway. So that was kind of summarizing what has been expressed previously.
Okay. Mr. Watkins.
I just wanted to stress the importance of us having a collaborative look at this draft of this poll, just because of everything that was mentioned earlier. In order for us to successfully pass a bond or a parcel tax in this community, everybody has to be represented at the table. So I know that with Brian's numerous polls, in fact, I probably have numerous saved in various folders in my computer. We can look at this thing and do this very quickly, but I think it helps that we do this in a collaborative fashion, just because there are so many constituency groups that are going to be affected by it. So the direction I do appreciate the split sample, which Brian explained. I think that's going to help us get to a place where we understand the difference between how a community supports the bond measure. But I mean, one of the things we haven't talked about yet is this square footage versus a flat rate. And I understand what Superintendent Thompson is talking about in terms of looking at this previous poll, but as I mentioned, that previous poll really has really zero legitimacy, especially in today's climate, and especially the way they did their methodology. So I'd like to kind of reboot and just make sure that whatever we get done is done thoroughly and amply so that we can have some quality research to make a collective decision.
I think that so from that standpoint, I tend to like, there's one of the things that I try to do is personally as an individual is to kind of, we're paying the expert to do the expert job, right? And so what we'll probably do as a group is figure out what we want our learning goals to be. What do we want to learn? And allow the professional that we're paying to do this to actually run, to run their process because like I said, they are the experts. So I'd like to kind of avoid as much as possible, personally, as one person, to try to, shape questions in ways that could have an impact on the outcome. Like really, this should be an independent, an independently run research project. And I think what we all can do together here is identify what are the outcomes that we want to learn. What are the things that we want to learn? And then we hand that over to Mr. Godby, who then crafts a survey around that. And if one of those learning goals is we want to figure out what the what the acceptance thresholds are, then we can certainly say this is a learning outcome that we're looking for, and then trust our experts to actually do that for us. At least that's kind of why that's actually why we're paying Mr. Goodby. I'll be right back. I have to go get my adapter because I need to plug in, but I'll be back in a second or two. But we've got a question from member Chima, and I'll be right back.
So it's not a question though, it's just a comment, and I agree with you. The things you just mentioned, that we are asking a professional firm to do the job. Yes, we have the interest and we can give our input ahead of time to the firm so that they can keep our goals in mind when they are crafting the questions. So I agree that we need to be out of their work.
And I think the starting point for that is basically looking at the two surveys that have been done in the past. Those were at least at those moments in time. And like I said, the last one was done in January, where those were identified by a number of ways, number of meetings, number of these types of meetings as the priorities Rick's right, that things have changed. The methodology may not have been the best one used by ISOM, but the priorities that have been identified were identified first in October of 2018, then again in January of 2020. And so that is, I think, the starting point, Brian, when it comes to, what are those, since we have those two things that have withstood over a year's worth of time as priorities for the district, that is a good place to start, I think. And then if the priorities need to be adjusted, I think there's two different things. There's methodology, and that includes how the questions are asked, what type of delivery mechanism you use. And then on our end, Brian just needs to know what are the district's priorities in terms of where is this money going to go once it comes in, either for a bond or a parcel. And like I said, that part there's been quite a bit of work that's been done on that already, which is at least a foundational starting point for us moving forward. And given the timing, I think that would be wise to look at that. And that would certainly also, despite differences in methodology and whatnot, give us somewhat of a comparison between where the community was and where they are now, even if it's not completely apples to apples.
And as John alluded to, we certainly have that, those 2 surveys. So we've got wording and we've got priorities that you had set in advance. We may tweak the wording a little bit because we have our approach to writing ballot questions and to writing both in the survey and the ultimate ballot questions, but at least we have an indication of where you were headed before.
Okay. Member Canlis, you have a question or a comment?
Yes, I have a comment to support what Mr. Nishihara has mentioned, and that is this meeting's goal is to collect those input and look at the district priority and be clear about what outcome we want to know, what we want to learn. And then we leave Brian, the experts, to craft those questions. That's why we pay them to do that. So I'm just in support of let's get those input right now and then leave the expert to continue on working on those questions because our timeline is really, really short. Thank you.
Yeah. Okay, I have a question. Thank you, Member Canlis. I actually do have a something that's been talked about. One of the things that concerns me with a parcel tax, by the way, I think personally, I think a parcel tax is fantastic because it gives us the flexibility that we need. One of the things that I would just like to understand a little bit more, one of the things that scares me about the parcel tax is the fact that it's only a finite period of time, right? It's either 4 or 8 or whatever we decide that it's going to be. Can you talk a little bit about how evergreen parcel taxes have been doing, how they've been trending?
Good question. We don't call them evergreen. We don't call them in perpetuity. We call them, and many attorneys have said that this is legal, we call them until ended by voters.
Until ended by voters, okay.
Right. Very specific wording. It's been validated in Southern California in a court case. I couldn't cite that right now, but we want your legal counsel to weigh into that. If you want to do in perpetuity, that's the right way to do it. We like the tax rates. We'll pick the ideal term and the ideal rate, and that is our basic question through most of the survey. And then at the end, we can do fallbacks in the tax rate. In your last survey, you started at 225, and then you went down to 180, I think it was, and then further down below that. So we can do that same sort of analysis. We do it again in a different order than what you did before, but we can do the same thing with the sunset. Start with the until ended by voters, and then test fallbacks. The reality, though, with the sunset is people don't focus on the until ended by voters. They kind of like that. It empowers them, and it works pretty well. But if you were to fall back to 16 years, let's say, I can guarantee you that will do horribly. And then if you fall back to 12 years, that'll do almost as poorly. And then if you have another fallback that's 8 years, that'll do much better. Why? Because it's a single digit. It's not any of the 2-digit sunsets just do terribly, and they do worse, strangely enough, than until ended by voters, even though until ended by voters is really forever. And that's just the way it works.
Okay, so
But
basically, if I'm hearing you correctly, they have not been parcel taxes that are in perpetuity until ended by voters have not had a chance at all in recent years.
It's been harder, yeah. I mean, we've wound up being in the 8-year time frame. Sometimes it's 9 years because it gives you a little bit of a wiggle room if you don't win in the prescribed election cycle. But yeah, I mean, sunsets under 10 years have still worked better. I mean, we don't have to go as short as 4, but we need to be in single digits.
Okay. All right. Mr. Gardner, you have your hand up.
Yes, I wanted to talk about having stakeholders involved with the questions. I certainly understand from a purely research perspective that you would want to trust the experts to be the experts, just kind of like teachers want to have as much insight and control over how curriculum is given because they're experts in the classroom. I certainly understand that from a pure research perspective, but from a political perspective, it's vital to have community and stakeholders involved. I mean, it's probably always kind of true, but in New Haven right now, it's especially true. We've been doing a lot of bridge building over this year, and it's been mending, but there's still a lot of healing that does need to be happened. And if we're going to get stakeholders involved in supporting this and volunteering hours or time or money to get this passed, they really need to own it. And so even though from the pure research, so like, yeah, I mean, let the expert be the expert part, but involved the part of getting the politics of the people to not only say that they're for it, but to actually spend time and effort to get it passed is going to be really important that teachers, community, parents, CSEA are all involved in this part so that they feel a sense of ownership. Whereas if you guys just show up in a couple of months, is like, hey, here's what we decided, there's going to be a lot of knee-jerk skepticism in the process. And so from a political perspective, I think it's important that you have people involved, even though it's probably going to make Brian's job more difficult and obnoxious, and I'm sorry for that, but I really think it's going to be important to get people involved.
So if I heard Mr. Godbee's point of view on that, it sounds like he has a very clear kind of best practice against that. That's what I'm hearing. And I tend to agree with you, Michael, in terms of when it comes to the advocacy part of it, right? We, you know, as we start to come together as a community to advocate for a position, that's one thing. One of the, where I think it becomes a little dicey is when we try to shape the data for a particular outcome. And I think that's ultimately what I believe is the spirit of Mr. Godbee's best practice. That's my own particular point of view on that. One person's point of view. Mr. Godbee, would you like to comment on that at all?
Sure. I mean, again, as I said earlier, the best practice is we don't want to do this in a public session because that's just not the right way to do a survey. We don't want people walking away with all the questions and passing them on to their neighbors and telling them on Nextdoor what the answers are. And that's just introduces so many error rate variables that we just can't rely on the data. You know, as fallbacks, we have, as I said, worked with an ad hoc member of our ad hoc committee of the board. Sometimes that includes bargaining units and staff, and then the other end of the spectrum is the working with staff. So, and ultimately, you know, one of those two options is fine with me, but you know, it's ultimately the board's decision, except for the fact that we just can't do this in a public meeting.
Yeah. Okay, and then the other issue is around timing as well. Do we have enough time in the cycles to be able to do these rounds of iterations and still get the surveys fielded in a timely manner? I'm going to recognize two more speakers from the attendees because I do need to manage this meeting because we have some particular outcomes that we need for this meeting to give everybody who needs direction. So with that, the two panelists that are the two attendees that have their hands up right now are Rick Waltham and Michael Gardner. So Rick, if you could go first, and please
Brian,
try to limit it to one really impactful question.
Yeah, here's the impactful question for you, Brian Godbee. Ready? It's all about, I of course agree with everybody about your level of expertise. I am not a researcher, but I've seen a lot of these polls put together. And I want to go back to the question of the flat rate versus the square footage. And I think within 24 to 48 hours, I'm sure that the chief business officer and others within the district can sort of calculate how much money the district could generate through a square footage parcel tax at a certain rate that's acceptable and run in other districts. I know you have experience with those levels. I do too. And then we could also look, comparatively speaking, with a flat rate and make sure that that's tested adequately, and while at the same time making sure that we get a legal opinion from the district as well as outside. And I'm willing to take part in any of this to help with that. But just I think that's something that has to be made part of this survey.
So, Mr. Waltham, to articulate what you're trying to get to as a learning outcome, how would you articulate that? I want to learn what is it? Threshold values? Is it like if we could give direction to Mr. Godby to say, this is what we want to learn, now without actually having to articulate the question, what is the thing that we want to learn?
Right. Listen, President Nishihira, I do not want to manipulate the data whatsoever. Let's just be very clear. I want
Sure.
quality data here. That's why we talked about bringing Godby in the first place. What I want to be able to do now with Brian here and his firm is test different flat rate levels, which we talked about. But I also want to look at a square footage rate that we know is going to generate more money for the general fund. And so I want to make sure that that is also tested at an adequate rate. Now I know that he's doing a split sample, and I know that he can find a way to put that into the research.
Mm-hmm. Now, Mr. Godby, if you did want to take that on as a special, would you create a special set of cohorts for that specific question as well?
Well, as I mentioned, we did this in Fremont. Of course, Fremont Unified is substantially larger. So we have a sample universe that's big enough to do the split sampling we want. We're limited in New Haven Unified because you're not Fremont. So I think would have to decide whether we want to test a bond versus a parcel tax, or a parcel tax flat rate versus a parcel tax square foot. We can't do all three. There just aren't enough voters in Union City to do that. Okay. And so I think the first question is a legal one. And ultimately that's, you need your legal advisor to tell you whether you can do it or not. And I agree with Rick that there are districts that do it and have done it and haven't been sued. But I'll tell you that the legal counsel in Fremont Unified said absolutely no. And it was not pleasant.
Okay.
So
right,
Lance, to kind of structure this, sorry, I can't raise my hand.
Yeah.
I think what we need to figure out is we can talk to legal counsel on our end and see what they say. And then really then the choice would be, if legal counsel says, well, yeah, you could take that risk or whatever, let's assume that they say, sure, yeah, there's precedent for it, you can go ahead. Then basically, Brian, if I heard you correctly, we would be deciding whether or not we want to either juxtapose the flat rate versus the by square footage for a parcel, or pond versus parcel, but we can't do all three. So that's a choice.
Yeah, it's a choice. Now, based on my experience, and Rick may weigh in and agree with this, I've never found a place where we did test the square foot that it didn't do better. It just doesn't. Okay. So that's a choice. If you get the legal opinion that says you can do it, it can be a square foot parcel tax versus a bond measure. There's nothing wrong with that either, just as long as there's two splits.
I mean, I'd like to interject a little bit and just say, like, the question, one of the principles that I have is, like, I would really like not to do a study if we think that we're going to get the same answer that we kind of already thought we were going to get. And so one of the things that I kind of feel, just based on what I've known so far, is the fact that I think we probably could pass the bond measure. And I don't know if that's necessarily the most important thing for us to learn right now. Because, with bonds, I just think that there are some issues with bonds, right? Like from a taxpayer standpoint, it's actually a longer burden, right? Buildings and facilities are not our biggest issue right now, right? I'd be, the money isn't as flexible as it could be, not going to help us out of our current situation. And we actually don't even have time to put together a good project list, right? Because we would need the time to actually, figure out exactly what we would be asking for in a bond. So there's a lot of upfront work that we haven't really done yet. There's just a few other reasons. I don't want to go through all of the reasons, but I think the point is from a research standpoint, I feel relatively confident that we would be able to pass a bond. But I guess the question is that the right question, right? For us to do a good research effort that is actually worth it, maybe to Rick's point, getting more insights on a flat rate or square footage might be a better use of the research time. Because honestly, at this point with a bond, I don't know really. Aside from the things that we've been talking about, which are like creating ways of capitalizing on our find ways of generating general fund revenue from our properties. That's fine, but that actually is a little bit of runway for us to actually get that going. So I don't know if we're talking about a limited time frame. I think that a better question might be for this research survey is not bond versus parcel. My feeling is the best use of this is the different types of parcels. That's the way it actually sounds to me anyway at this point. I've got a few hands up. I'm actually going to go with let's see, we've got Sarah G. And as a time check, we only have 10 minutes.
Okay,
yeah.
Thank you so much. You have said very well. I agree with you that we will be able to pass the bond measure. I have that kind of general feeling, but at the same time, bond does not serve our purpose at this time. You have said, you have already mentioned those reasons. And also, we still have some money left in our account from the previous bond. So it's not the right time for the bond. And if we need it, we will have the bond again, 2 years from now or whatever. So I think we should, personally, I think that we should go for the parcel tax. And this will be a good use of our resources if we analyze that, should we go with the lump sum, or with the square foot tax. That will be good use of our resource. I agree with you.
Right. Thank you, Member Chima. Member Canlis.
Yes, those are all good reasons why we want to go one way or another. My only worry is we want to pass whatever it is we're going to get. And I don't know if the 7%, I'm rounding it, is going to pass in this new environment. We all want to, whatever it is, bond or parcel tax, it doesn't matter to me right now because we need the money one way or another. But my worry is on the current environment of having one thing pass. We want to pass something, and that worries me. I heard way back during our discussion, Derek's mentioned that there's a 30% of the community that never vote for anything. So with that information and the high percentage of having to pass a parcel tax, is kind of a little scary to me not to have anything at all. So I'm just worried that because it's so high, I'm afraid with the current environment, with lack of employment and people losing their jobs, I'm afraid that we won't reach the 66% requirement.
Yeah.
Just a thought.
Okay. Member Wong.
I just want to say that, okay, through the studies, I get all the information I want. I pretty support and what you said. And for the time concerned, should we doing something, and we need to really consider the time and what's the best. Just like the member, the Candace said, yes, we want to pass. That's a goal. But I don't want to, we don't need to spend so much time, and we'll see which is easy and to get it. So we stop debate. We have so many things that are good, bad, we know it, and nothing perfect. the parcel tax, and it seems like it's very difficult at this moment. So we really go through or take risk. Yeah.
Yeah, I mean, honestly, there's another way that we can look at this, right? I mean, we're only looking at it for 2020 and 2022. The way that I kind of think about it is, if we go for a parcel tax, I mean, we're really going to have to get the community together. We're all going to have to work together to get past. But like, you know, we've been able to do it before. I mean, it's tough, right?
Yes.
But if you look at the long game, maybe the short game is do a parcel tax right now, give us some general fund relief, right? At the same time, figure out how to use our bond to be able to monetize and capitalize on the assets that we have right now. So for example, we've been talking about either employee housing or multi-use areas or things like that that can actually generate, I think Mr. Dutra said between $1.5 and $2 million sustaining revenue, right? So there's the short game, which is let's deal with the crisis locally in terms of this lack of state funding, and then find ways of creating long-term reoccurring revenue through some type of bond measure that allows us to do that from a sustaining standpoint. I think that's a way to look at it. Member Kenneth.
That's really creative thinking and it makes sense. But I was under the impression when we scheduled this meeting with Brian that his job is to be able to see, because everybody kept on saying, let's get public's input and see what they want to do with this after the changes in our environment. So I thought Brian's job would be to find out whether the community would like to go for a bond or partial tax. Otherwise, we would have made this decision way back when 3 times we've had this opportunity as a board to discuss this, but people decided to go and have somebody else help us out. And I think this is the opportunity for Brian to help us out, find out from the community what they want to do instead of us discussing it right now. Because I didn't think this was the objective of this meeting. I thought the objective was for Brian to get information from the public and the community. Thank you.
Well, that would be the goal for the study. The goal for this board meeting is to determine the learning goals and actually the parameters for which we would be fielding the study, and to establish a timeline and next steps. And as a time check, we only have 4 minutes left. So looks like Chief Business Official Heldman has her hand up.
Yeah, it's a question for Brian, actually. The per square footage was mentioned. I've heard different things, and I think when we were considering the survey for that, what happened in LA Unified was still kind of fresh, because I think that's what they attempted last year. But I've heard different things, and most of them probably anecdotal in terms of voters. If it's square footage, they get very confused on what that means in terms of which part of their house, if they have a unit that has an outdoor area. I mean, like I said, maybe what I've heard about the confusion surrounding that is anecdotal. So my question to you, Brian, is what is the ratio in your experience in terms of those that were done per square footage versus a flat? Has there been post-mortem on the ones that were not successful? Were those really the confusion that people just decided not to vote because they were so confused on what the fiscal impact is to their pockets?
Yeah, good question. From what I've seen, there's not that much confusion around the per square foot. People just don't do the math. And so it sounds like a small number. I mean, if you go back and look at your ballot question that you tested for the bond measure before, it was by levying an estimated 6 cents per $100 of assessed valuation. Nobody can do that math either. Now, in the old days when we didn't have to have the rate in a bond measure question on the ballot, we used to talk about $60 per 100,000 of assessed valuation, which is a little easier to do the math, but it still requires math. And that's one of the advantages bonds have long had, being completely candid. When you move parcel taxes to a flat square foot approach, you benefit the same way.
Okay. So a couple things, time check. We have 2 minutes left. We have a bunch of hands up. What I'd like you to do is, if you don't have a question, put your hand down or a comment. And then if you do, okay, so we'll cap it where we are right now. And so what I'd like to do is just kind of have a recap. Do we have a recap of direction? Like, do we have could we spend a little bit of time just recapping what the direction is to staff and to Mr. Godby?
Well, the first thing, Lance, I'll jump in, and from the staff perspective, we need to consult with legal counsel to see whether or not we can, the legal advice is that we should consider a per square footage parcel. And if the answer is yes, then we need consensus on whether or not we want to compare a flat rate or a per square foot split survey for a parcel. And if legal counsel says no, then we're back to doing a split sample for a flat rate between a bond and a parcel. I think that's what I'm hearing.
That sounds right to me. Board, do you guys generally have a consensus on that? That seems to be a clear direction. Okay, I don't see any reactions either way, so that does sound like it's a good direction.
Yes.
Okay, and then the other thing that we're going to want to get some direction on is timing. There is possibly, we'd love to maybe get the survey administered maybe the week of 6/22, if that's too aggressive.
That's what we've discussed. Yeah, that's right.
Okay, 6/22, and then we can have the results presented on the week of 7/4, as I believe reasonable. And then we could actually have a resolution determining specifically what we want to do on 7/27. So a ballot measure resolution on the week of the 7/27. Does that sound like, are there any objections from any members of the board? Okay, if there are no objections, that seems like that's good direction. Without objections, I think one of the things that I'd like to do, there's one more hand up from Mr. Waltham. Mr. Waltham, I'm assuming you have a comment.
Just real quickly, the New Haven Teachers Association, as far as I know, and having many conversations with their leadership, is not interested in pursuing a bond measure to the same issues that you raised earlier, President. And we need to look at relief to the general fund, investing in your staff. And so that's really where the synergy is going to come from. And I keep on hearing talk about a bond measure, but I've never really understood how we got to that needs assessment place where the bond measure was being talked about in the first place, because as far as I know, our members have not been tested in terms of their facilities, in terms of their needs. And so back to that question about campaigning, if we want to pass this measure, we really have to get everybody on board, and that includes the teachers. This is a November 2020 cycle, which is presidential. We have a higher turnout, and so we know we can get this thing done. But I really want to stress the importance of testing a parcel tax at all levels, plus the square footage. I'm not interested in a bond measure at all.
Yeah, I think that sounds given our current situation. It's really important that we get the will of the people of Union City, and that's really why this is. We are here to represent the citizens of Union City, and so to get their valuable feedback is going to be critical in having us move forward together. And so I think that the direction right now is we're going to, staff is going to get legal counsel on whether or not we can do a per square foot or a flat tax. And we will take that under serious advisement, and then, kind of proceed from there. And the timelines that we discussed seem to have no objections from the board. So I think we're going to be doing that. Staff. So the question to staff: do we have any further questions or lack of clarity in terms of direction?
So, Rick's comments aside, the directions I have written down are still, we're going to pursue legal advice on whether or not we can even, whether or not the per square footage tax is a non-starter. If they say yes, we're going to do the split between the two different ways of gathering that tax for a parcel. If they say no, I know NHTA, or at least Rick is saying CTA does not support a bond, but if legal says nope, way you can only go forward with a flat rate tax, do we still want to do the bond parcel comparison? My thinking behind that would be that if we come back and we get 30% of the people saying they would support parcel, we're not going forward with a parcel. But having some data about a bond would be helpful. The reality is there are things we can do with a bond that would free up general fund money. And on top of that, you can take your old facilities, the old facilities report that was generated, and we didn't even come close to coming to completing that, just on the stuff that was needed last time we went around. I mean, we have probably 100 aging portables that are going to fail. So then the question would be, I guess, do we, if you're splitting, doing the polling as between a bond and a parcel, and the parcel fails miserably, but the bond is favorable, well, do we still want to go forward with the bond or not? I guess that would be the question. So
yeah, I mean, further, the question that I would ask is, do we even need to study, right? So I mean, if do we feel confident enough, at least in the data that we have so far, that we'd be able to hit 55.5%? Is that the thing? Like, if we decide that we can't, I guess that's the question, right? If it turns out that we can't do per square foot, then the question is, all right, are we going to do a bond, or like that type of thing? So, I mean, I guess, like I said, to your point, but this board has to put together a plan, right, for what we're going to do with the bond if we have it, right? That's why I was saying,
we already have. I mean, we did the survey already based on the information that we had. Granted, it's over a year old, but nothing's been done to fix any of that. So the need is there. It's just a matter of, it seems like parcel is we haven't got consensus from the board definitively on whether parcel or bond. We definitely understand where NHTA and CTA stand on that. But again, if the parcel fails miserably when Brian does his polling, then the question would be, do we want to, in this new environment now where everyone is, who knows where people stand, is it worth knowing whether or not the community still would support a bond or not? I don't know the answer to that.
Yeah. And remind me, for the publicly funded part of the campaign, we're talking about a $300,000 outlay. Is that roughly what we're talking about? That's to either Annette or John.
Yeah, that's not my expertise for the advocacy part of it. That you need to talk to a political consultant, and they'll tell you about the information as well.
So, President Nishihara, are you asking in terms of the cost of the campaign?
Correct. Like if you're trying to balance kind of risk versus reward, right? Risk versus,
I was not involved in the two parcel taxes in 2011 and 12. Like I said earlier, I do know that there was one survey done for 2011. And then we went for it again the next year. We didn't do the district did not do another survey for the second round. when the district went out for the GO bond, the latest one that we have, we did not do a survey. And there was a committee, there was a campaign committee who hired a campaign consultant, and we raised funds, solicited some donations. Altogether, I believe we raised about $55,000, and we spent not all of it. We actually had some change that we even donated to the foundation, but that was a very low-key grassroots campaign where everyone actually got together. We had our we had support from the local folks that we have, even NHTA. But yeah, in terms of that, so I can't speak about how much it was for the parcel tax. I wasn't quite involved, but I have to be the treasurer for Measure M, and that's why I remember it very clearly. We didn't do a survey on that one.
But if New Haven Unified attempts a parcel tax in whatever form, there is going to be some public outlay. There will be an outlay from our general fund. Is that correct? Or there's not at all?
The survey, the cost of the survey is going to come from the general fund, but the cost of the campaign, no.
There's not even like there's like the information piece and then the advocacy piece. There's not even like a general fund consideration for the information.
I remember
I can answer that question if you like.
Yeah, I was going to say, can someone chime in, because I can't remember
this
that
is what
part.
I was trying to explain this earlier, and Bill Quirk chimed in. There are two phases to any campaign, a bond or a parcel. The first phase is the public phase, which you're currently in. You've hired a pollster. It is paid for by the district. You can also, in the public phase, do informational pieces regarding the information, not the advocacy, right? You're not going to ask for a pro or con approach, but you can do informational pieces. Once the resolution is accepted by the board and it qualifies for the ballot, then you go into the private phase. A committee is formed. It's separate from the district. It's not government tax dollars. These are private donations. And that's when you advocate for the measure to the voters.
All right.
There's one other component too, because the question was, what's the impact of the general fund? And regardless of what measure you put on the ballot, there is a cost for the Alameda County Registrar of Voters that they will charge you for a ballot measure. And it's per the number of voters. You've got about 40,000. So it's 5, 6, 7. I mean, it just depends on how many other measures there are and what a deal they're getting on printing. And postage as well.
Okay, great. Thank you very much. Member Counts.
Yes, I'd like to go back to John's question about moving forward. So for me, I would like to see Brian to check for both, because as you already said, what if parcel people don't agree with the parcel? I don't want to just stop there. I want to continue to make sure that we also find out what people are thinking about the bond, because we got to get something one way or the other. Just because it's not the one we want doesn't mean we could turn down the other amount of monies that could come to us. We're in desperate need of something to come into our pockets right now. So I would like to support the proposition of split survey, where you do both bond and the parcel, so that if we don't become successful with the parcel, we could go for the bond.
Okay, so I think as it stands right now, it's going to be kind of an if-then, right? If we're going to go to legal counsel, and if they're comfortable with us doing a square foot, then our two different cohorts are going to be parcel tax per square foot and parcel tax flat tax. If legal comes back and says no, it has to be flat tax, then the two cohorts are going to be between a partial flat tax and a bond. That's the current direction that staff has.
But I think what Linda is saying is that if there's going to be a split between flat versus square foot, then we're not going to be doing the bond. Is that what the suggestion would be?
Right. Yeah. But
And I
then
think
what
what she's saying is that the whole reason why we are redoing the survey is because we all believe that there's a change in climate, right?
Right.
Yeah.
Because of that change, we decided to proceed with the new survey with the same variable for parcel tax and a bond. And to John's point, John did say that, you know, even if we do have a bond that passes, it will free up some general fund that could potentially help us. But if we know that, my only concern is the city is also having a parcel tax on the ballot.
Yeah.
And obviously Brian will know more of that because he's worked with them as well. And I know that their initial one, and I don't know what the survey had alluded to before, and obviously it didn't pass, and it lost, I think, on a slim margin, but still it lost, right? So we want to be able to put on something on a ballot that's actually going to pass. If we're going to be spending our time, energy, and money on this, we need something that can actually, one, pass, and two, essentially help us either in our facilities and also free up our general fund. I think that could be a win-win for both.
Yes.
Okay, so is that at odds with our current direction to staff? Are you saying, Sharon, that you don't want to see the different, that you're not interested in learning about the
No. So I understood it. I understood it to be where you cannot have 3 of those on the language, right? So it has to be either flat or square footage, or one or the other of the parcel or bond. So you cannot choose all 3. It has to be bond or parcel in one way, or parcel in, split. So I think what Linda, if I understand her correctly, is, and I agree as well, that we need to stick with what we had said in terms of the reason for doing this survey is to test out the new changes that this new climate has brought. And if we know that obviously we have 100 portables, as John said, and we were looking into the teacher housing, all that is bond money that's going to be needed. And if for whatever reason the bond money, if bond does pass, we can have general fund free up, then that's money that could be used towards other salaries or other personnel consideration. So that was my understanding, but the way you had it, I think that given the direction, it seemed to me that it was either going to be bond or one with the parcel. If not bond, then parcel split.
Ms. Kaur understood my point correctly. Yes, thank you.
Okay. Great. And then I believe the staff has direction. I would like to make one ask explicit. For the learning goal, what I'd like to know very explicitly, if it hasn't already been articulated explicitly, is that I would love to know what chance an education-based parcel tax would fare against a public safety parcel tax in this current environment. That is, so like, I don't know how you would do that necessarily, but I think that should be an explicit objective of our research effort.
Unless I got to back you up, I don't think we have direction right now. I think we have 2 board members saying they just want to survey bond parcel versus parcel, and 2 board members in the if-then component. I think you and Sarabjit would like to explore the flat rate versus square footage first, if it's legally permissible, and only then, that's not permissible, do the bond parcel. I think Sharon and Linda are saying, no, we just want to do the bond versus parcel. So I think we have a 2-2 board.
Is that an accurate statement, Member Kaur and Member Campbell? You're not interested in the if then, you're interested
in. Well,
I
think we can certainly get a clarity from legal. I don't know how that would play out in terms of the actual survey that will be conducted, but I think we can get a clarity. But for me, I think for us to move forward, I would like to see bond versus parcel, whichever parcel. What I mean, I don't know if it's numbers that maybe Annette can run and then decide if it's something that gets us a better revenue on having a flat parcel tax versus square footage. I don't know, Annette, I don't want to put you on the spot, but if that's something that you have the capacity of doing, then that decision could be made in-house. Based on what we do. But I would like to see the bond passability rates as well.
Okay. All right. So, all right, then it sounds like there are two. It sounds like there are two different similar but different points of view, which is muddying the staff direction. So, Member Wong, do you have a point of view on the direction we should take? The two directions are, one, ask legal counsel if we can entertain a per square foot or a flat tax, and then if they say yes, you can, then the poll that we do will be really to determine the passability between those two, one with square foot, one flat. If not, if legal says no, we can't, then the research effort will be, okay, bond versus a parcel tax, flat rate.
Okay, and I kind of like it between these two, and I'm more favor to the Ms. Ko and Mr. Member Candace and Member Post. Okay, we need to ask the legal first. That's my concern. If yes, okay, the next, if no, that's easier, and the bond versus to the parcel tax. But if yes, then, and since I heard the voice, they say, let's more the study and between the square footage and the flat rate. But my concern, if we will do study, and do we have enough time? And my suggestion is, and since the Brian mentioned, that's not a common, have so many parcel tax in the same and ballot. Okay, I will ask the teachers unions, and you guys, if you have favor to the bonds, and can we post, we will have a resolution to the bond, but the timing concern of not in this ballot. That's my concern. So basically, I said first we do the legal and to check yes or no. Yeah, if I think this time to change the flat rate and the square foot rate, the rates, and I think they will cost a long, and maybe even cost more fail and to the November the elections. So, and for the Sharon and for the Ms. Ko and the Member Coase and the Member Kenneth, the other way is more rational. At least we have something on hold. We spend the money with studies and we try to succeed. Yeah.
Okay, Member Chima. Keep in mind we are 20 minutes over right now, so we should try to wrap this up as soon as we can. Member Chima.
So I think it was mentioned from Brian that in Fremont, legal advised them to not go for the per square footage. Is that right, Brian?
That's correct. Their bond counsel was very definitive on that. And I have another couple clients that use a different bond counsel, and he was not quite as definitive, but he essentially said 2 courts have ruled on this. One in Southern California, which gives you a favorable opinion of the parcel of the per square foot, and one in Northern California, which does not. And his conclusion is, what part of the state do you live in? We live in the north, so I know if I ask that same bond counsel, I'm going to get another "don't do this" answer, and I can provide John with that opinion and contact name in the morning.
I'm not asking about bond. I'm asking a parcel counsel.
No, there aren't really parcel tax councils. They're all bond councils at the end of the day, and they do both.
So I'm leaning towards the already. I think we don't need to reinvent it. That we should go for the flat rate or for the per square footage. So I am for the flat rate, but I'm for the parcel tax. I just want to clarify my position to you guys.
Yeah, I think if we're talking about in terms of research, right, which is what we want to learn, my feeling is and I could be wrong on it, but my feeling is we would probably be able to pass a bond. So I don't know if that's I don't know how, maybe I'm wrong, but I don't know how much it would be, how useful it would be to survey that as a research work. So if we just can't do it, then, if we can't do a square footage parcel tax, because that seems to be have a higher likelihood of passing. If we can't do that, then do we really need to study whether or not we could pass a bond? Because we probably can pass a bond based on everything that we've seen so far.
That's
Sarah,
it.
Throw
And
out
the
there
study
three-
is, sorry, the study is because we are in a new circumstance
right. That's
because
what
of the COVID and the BLM.
that's right.
all right, that's fair.
Okay.
Okay, Member Wong.
Okay, I mean, I pretty agree with you. And so, I mean, according to the data, we see it and look like the bond is more easier and to pass. I didn't mean the bond guaranteed pass, but much easier. Yeah. So, and I need to ask for Brian, and you mentioned that that's not a common the things and in the same ballot and have so many parcel tax. And what do you suggest? Yeah.
Well, you're right. It is easier to pass a bond measure, at least in terms of the threshold necessary. It is, there are different constituencies. And, you've heard from Rick tonight about that. He's the central constituency, or his people are, for the parcel tax. I think that
According to the new data, how many bond measures have failed in this March? That was a very high number. So don't take anything for granted.
That's right. But I think March was an anomalous situation because two things collided. One was Democrats were waiting to see who was going to be in the primary because candidates were getting out in the last weeks of the election. And so they were holding their ballots, and there were a lot of absentee ballots that were being held. And as those voters were holding to see who the Democratic candidates were going to be, the stock market started tumbling even before the shutdown happened. So I think those two things, which are highly unusual, are what led to the failure of not only bonds but parcel taxes in March. It was a horrible day for schools. But at the same time, city general tax measures passed at a 70% level statewide.
Okay.
So,
All right.
And what's the difference here? 55 for a bond is a lot closer to 50 plus 1 for a general tax for cities. So they were successful, schools weren't, because of the higher thresholds.
Okay. All right. Well then, we still have so I haven't moved on my position. I don't know if Sarah G has moved on her position. We still have kind of a 2-2, a 2-2. So I think with Jeff, and I'm fine with deferring this to Jeff. Jeff, would you like to do a confer with legal counsel, and then depending on the outcome, for a parcel tax or a square foot based tax, do a study on parcel versus bond, or do you just want to go directly to a parcel to look at parcel versus bond?
Okay, my point is, first of all, we ask the legal to the advisor. If yes, let's study it, and for the parcel and federate and first to the square foot. Okay.
All right. So then you basically agree with the proposal for Member Chima.
Yes. Yeah.
Okay. All right. Staff, is there any Member Chima?
I think he agrees with your position more. And I agree with your positions also to have the per square footage. But my only concern is, like Aneth has mentioned, and it was mentioned earlier, so there could be less likelihood of passing that. So it's like flat rate. Okay, people understand it, they get it. So that's the only thing. I know if we go by square foot, it will bring more money in. My only concern is that if people, they will be able to understand and support it. So otherwise, I agree with your position, though.
My understanding also is that the square footage will likely have a higher rate of getting approved, right?
Approved.
If I understand Mr. Godby, is that correct?
Yeah, where we have tested both, the square foot tends to do better. Yes.
Okay.
And I'm
it's good.
have to
Yeah, good,
excuse
good.
myself. I've got to join another call in 2 minutes.
Yeah. Okay. So it sounds like we have. It sounds like we have somewhat of a consensus. Member Canlis and Member Core, is this something we can live with?
Yeah, I mean, at the end of the day, I think we want something that we could pass and bring in revenue to our district. So I think that's the ultimate goal. So for me, it's not a big deal. I'm not gonna, lose sleep over this. But I think my whole point of the comment was that, the intention was really to kind of learn the new climate, right? I mean, I don't know how you sound very confident. I think we can all confidently say, yes, the bond will pass because it has a higher passage percentage, right? Or the availability of it.
Lower threshold.
Right. So, and I think the other question could be, well, that was prior to COVID. How are people feeling now, right? I thought the whole point of doing the survey was for that reason, but I can certainly live with having flat versus square footage parcel on if our community is going to support either one, then I don't have an issue with that.
Okay.
Same.
Member Canlis?
Yeah, same here. At the end of the day, we want to make sure we have some type of income coming to our district. It doesn't matter to me whether it's a bond or it's a partial tax. We want something for our district, for our kids. But again, I want to share my worry that the threshold for passing bond is much lower and more attainable and realistic than the threshold for passing a partial tax. And also, like Ms. Gore, I thought the reason for this meeting is to ask Brian to check with the community, one or the other, and now we're changing direction right in the middle of the game, but I'm okay. I just want to let you know what I'm thinking.
Okay.
Okay.
Thank you. Oh yes, Member Wong. And then
Okay, so and I have the same feeling. I'm very agree with the Sharon and Ms. Koo and the Ms. Callis. Okay, so we change the direction. So now, if legal say yes, and the square footage is the rates is okay, so we are no longer going to talking to the bond. Am I correct?
Yeah.
So, okay. So,
yeah.
Okay. If this is the way is everybody is agreed, I'm fine. But I am still want to everybody is concerned, and for the bond, that's easy to achieve at least, and we have something achievable for the November. Yeah.
Jeff, can I ask you a question? Are
Yes.
you supporting what Ms. Chima and Mr. Nishiara's, or are you supporting what Ms. Core and Ms. Callis are saying? I'm a little confused about your input.
I am very confusing this one. So I would agree is that number one, we ask legal to decide yes or no. After yes, then I want to understand that we are no longer going to discuss the bond, or we still will continue to discuss the bond. If we have a discuss bond, we have more confusing. We have 3 directions. But according to the superintendent and according to the branch, it's very difficult to achieve for the 3 directions. We only need 2 directions.
I'm still confused, Mr. Wang.
Let me ask you these questions. Is everybody agreed to ask, first things we ask the legal advice? Shall we go, can we do this, the agreed, or maybe suggested doing by the square foot, the rates, the
unless I misunderstood, I think Ms. Core and I are going directly to having Brian put the bond and partial tax into that survey with that and skip all that.
Yeah.
Okay.
Now we will definitely ask legal about whether or not we can support a per square foot parcel tax here. We can definitely get the answer to that.
Okay.
That isn't the issue at all.
Okay.
The issue is, do you want the survey to compare a bond and a parcel, or the 2 different types of of ways of collecting money from a parcel tax. So if we compare the square footage versus the per parcel collection of a parcel tax in the survey, you will not find out anything about the bond. So
Yes.
that's really the question.
What, yes to not finding out anything about the bond, or yes to find out bond and parcel tax?
It's about the survey. Do you want the survey to compare different types of parcel taxes, or do you want the survey to compare a bond or a parcel?
And the
survey.
idea being, if it's even an option, if it's even an option to entertain the two different types of parcel taxes, then that's what the research survey would be about. If not having two different types of parcel taxes is not an option, then the fallback position is we'll study a parcel versus a bond.
Right. So assuming that legal says that, this is really the argument right here. This is the discussion where I think we're 2-2. And Jeff, I'm still not sure where you stand. Sorry, but I'm not.
Right.
So if legal says yes, you can pass you can move forward with a per square footage parcel, then does this board, if the answer is yes to that, want to have the survey compare two different types of parcel taxes or a bond and a parcel tax? That is the only question on the table right now.
Okay, so in this way, I go into the survey for both the parcel tax. Yeah, different parcel tax.
All right. And Trustee
but I'm
Chima
really
and Trustee
considered the
Nishihara,
way-
you would,
yeah.
in that scenario, you would want just the comparing the two parcel taxes. Okay. So then it's 3-2.
And I can live with either one.
Okay.
All right. This was a lot of really great discussion. I really like the fact that we were able to walk this through. All right. So staff, I just want to make sure that you have clear direction from this and a clear set of timelines.
Yeah. So Lance, you and I are looking at the same document. I think what's written there is what the direction is. It's the if-then format. And I think, Annette, I think you're clear, right? Well, you and I can talk tomorrow about what council they use, and we'll go from there.
Yep.
Okay, I think we did it.
Thanks, everybody. Seeing no further hands and no further business, we're adjourned. Thanks, everybody.
Thanks, everybody.